You wake up at 6 in the morning, not because anyone forced you, but because you chose to. You chose the productivity app that tracks your sleep cycles. You chose the morning routine optimized for peak performance. You chose the self-improvement podcast playing while you prepare breakfast you don't have time to taste. And here's the most insidious part. You're proud of these choices. You've internalized the logic so completely that your exploitation feels like freedom. This is what neoliberalism accomplished. It didn't chain you to a factory floor. It convinced you to build your own factory inside your mind and to call it personal growth. Byung-Chul Han identified something that sounds impossible until you see it everywhere. We live in an age of self-exploitation, and we've learned to love it. The old capitalism needed external discipline, bosses watching, time clocks punching. The new capitalism is far more efficient. It made you your own overseer. It gave you the whip and taught you to smile while using it. They told you that you're not an employee anymore. You're an entrepreneur of the self. You're the CEO of You Incorporated. Every relationship is networking. Every skill is a marketable asset. Every experience is content waiting to be monetized. This language didn't arrive by accident. It's the result of a calculated transformation that began in the late 20th century when neoliberalism discovered that external control was expensive and inefficient. However, internal control is free. Better than free. It's profitable. Because when you internalize the logic of constant optimization, you don't need a boss. You become harder on yourself than any boss could legally be. You work weekends and call it hustle. You answer emails at midnight and call it dedication. You sacrifice relationships, health, peace, and call it ambition. The system doesn't have to force you. You volunteered. And here's what makes this particularly cruel. When you inevitably burn out, when your body finally rebels against the impossible standards you've imposed, the system has a diagnosis ready. You failed to optimize correctly. You didn't practice enough self-care. You need better time management, a new productivity system, a more positive mindset. The problem, they insist, is never structural. It's always personal. The system is fine. You're broken. Neoliberalism's greatest trick was convincing you that constraint is freedom, that having infinite choices means having power, that being forced to constantly choose, constantly decide, constantly curate is liberation rather than a new form of tyranny. You scroll through streaming platforms for 30 minutes, unable to choose what to watch. This is an abundance. It's the exhaustion of mandatory curation. But the system calls it freedom, and you've learned to agree. You optimize your dating profile, your LinkedIn presence, your Instagram aesthetic. You're not living. You're constantly auditing yourself, performing for an invisible audience that might grant you validation, opportunity, visibility. The unoptimized self becomes shameful, something to hide. Previous generations had to perform at work. You have to perform everywhere, always. Your leisure time isn't rest. It's an opportunity to demonstrate that you're resting correctly, productively, in ways that enhance your personal brand. The vacation photo isn't about the vacation. It's about the performance of having achieved the kind of life that includes vacations worth photographing. The book you're reading isn't just a book. It's a signal about the kind of person you're constructing yourself to be. And the most devastating part? You can feel this. You know something is wrong, but you've been taught to diagnose that feeling as your personal inadequacy rather than as an accurate perception of a sick system. When you feel exhausted by constant performance, they call it anxiety and sell you meditation apps. When you feel depleted by endless optimization, they call it depression and offer you seminars on resilience. When you want to stop, to rest, to exist without producing, they call it laziness and remind you that someone else is outworking you right now. The system has colonized even your resistance. Your rebellion gets repackaged as content. Your critique becomes a personal brand. Your exhaustion transforms into a market opportunity for wellness products. Han calls you the achievement subject, not the obedience subject of the old disciplinary society. Something far more insidious. Because the obedience subject knew they were being controlled. They could see the boss, the guard, the authority figure. They had someone to resist. You have no one to resist but yourself. And that's precisely the mechanism that makes this system so totalizing. The enemy is internal. The voice demanding more, better, faster sounds exactly like your own voice. Because it is your own voice. The system's greatest accomplishment was teaching you to speak its language as though it were your native tongue. When you feel the urge to check your phone every few minutes, you're not experiencing a personal weakness. You're experiencing the logical outcome of a system that profits from your fragmentation. Your inability to focus isn't a disorder. It's an accurate response to an environment deliberately designed to fracture your attention. The companies know this. They've hired neuroscientists and behavioral psychologists to engineer compulsion. Then they sell you the cure: productivity apps, digital well-being features, screen time trackers. They create the disease and monetize the treatment. And you blame yourself for getting sick. This is what Han means when he talks about the violence of positivity. The old system said no, you cannot. The new system says yes, you can. You could do anything. You could be anything. And when you inevitably fail to achieve the impossible standards of constant optimization, the failure is yours alone. You're encouraged to share everything. Your thoughts become tweets. Your meals become content. Your relationships become status updates. Transparency is presented as authenticity, as courage, as connection. But transparency serves another function. It makes you readable, predictable, monetizable. Every piece of data you volunteer becomes raw material for algorithms that know you better than you know yourself. Not because they understand you, but because they've mapped your patterns of behavior within human precision. You think you're sharing your life. You're actually performing unpaid labor, generating the data that makes surveillance capitalism function, training the AI that will eventually replace you, building the prison of prediction that constrains your future choices. And you do it willingly, enthusiastically, because the system convinced you that visibility equals existence, that the undocumented life is worthless, that privacy is what people with something to hide require. But here's what they never tell you. Opacity is resistance. Silence is power. The parts of yourself you refuse to commodify, to optimize, to share, those are the parts that remain yours. The system calls this antisocial. Han calls it the last refuge of freedom. When you feel the urge to disconnect, to disappear, to stop performing, you're not being lazy or fearful or inadequate. You're detecting the violence of mandatory visibility. Your withdrawal isn't pathology. It's sanity. Han describes this as the burnout society. Not because some individuals burn out, but because burnout is the system's fundamental mode of operation. It requires constant acceleration, infinite growth, perpetual expansion. These aren't sustainable metabolisms. They're formulas for exhaustion. The old disciplinary society had limits. Working hours, weekends, retirement. The achievement society has no limits. You're always on, always available, always behind. Your smartphone isn't a convenience. It's a leash. It ensures that work follows you home, into bed, into vacation, into every moment that used to belong to life rather than labor. But they can't call it a leash. So they call it connectivity, flexibility, freedom. Here's the paradox that Han identifies. You're more autonomous than any previous generation, and that autonomy is killing you. Because autonomy in the neoliberal sense doesn't mean freedom from exploitation. It means responsibility for your own exploitation. When a factory worker clocked out, their labor ended. When you close your laptop, nothing ends. The to-do list follows you. The unread emails accumulate. The metrics you haven't hit whisper accusations while you try to sleep. You're told this is empowerment. You set your own schedule. You work from anywhere. You're the architect of your own destiny. But architecture requires infinite decisions, and decisions require energy, and energy is precisely what this system depletes. Every choice becomes labor. What to eat, what to wear, what to watch, what to think, what to feel. The self becomes a project that's never finished, always requiring renovation, always falling short of its potential. And when you finally break, when the weight of infinite autonomy crushes you, the system has its explanation ready. You didn't practice enough self-care. You didn't set healthy boundaries. You didn't want it badly enough. The structural violence disappears. Only your individual failure remains visible. Notice what happened to your relationship with time. It's no longer measured in hours or days, but in productivity units. A morning isn't a morning. It's an opportunity to optimize. An evening isn't rest. It's recovery so you can produce tomorrow. Even your leisure got colonized. You don't just watch a film. You watch it efficiently, at increased speed, while checking your phone, optimizing even your entertainment consumption. You don't take a walk. You track your steps, monitor your heart rate, gamify your movement. The system taught you that unquantified experience is wasted experience. That life unmeasured is life unlived. So you measure everything, and in measuring, you transform living into accounting. Han calls this the terror of imminence. You're trapped in the immediate. The next task, the next notification, the next metric. There's no transcendence, no elsewhere, no outside. Just the eternal present of optimization. And here's what makes this particularly suffocating. You chose it. You downloaded the apps. You signed up for the tracking. You volunteered for the monitoring. The prison is self-imposed, which means you can't even enjoy the clarity of resistance. When someone forces you into a cage, at least you know you're imprisoned. When you build your own cage and call it productivity system, you lose even that knowledge. You feel tired, and they call it depression. You want to be alone, and they call it social anxiety. You can't focus, and they call it attention deficit. You're sad about a sick world, and they call it a chemical imbalance. The system has a diagnosis for every normal human response to abnormal conditions. Because if your suffering is medical, it can be treated individually. But if your suffering is structural, it requires collective action. And collective action threatens profit. So they medicalize your lucidity. Your accurate perception of exploitation becomes a symptom. Your body's rebellion against impossible demands becomes pathology. Your mind's refusal to accept absurdity becomes disorder. And the cure they offer? More individualization. Therapy to adjust you to adjusted conditions. Medication to help you tolerate intolerable situations. Mindfulness to make you peaceful about your own exploitation. None of this means that mental illness isn't real or that treatment isn't valuable. It means that the system has learned to weaponize diagnosis, to obscure structural violence by reframing it as personal malfunction. You've been taught that negativity is toxic, that criticism is unproductive, that saying no makes you difficult. So you say yes. You stay positive. You find the silver lining, and you wonder why you feel so tired. Han identifies this as the violence of positivity. The old power said no. The new power says yes, but only to more exploitation dressed as opportunity. Yes to the side hustle. Yes to the extra project. Yes to being always available, always optimistic, always grateful for the chance to work yourself into dust. Positivity becomes a demand. You must be enthusiastic about your own exhaustion. You must be grateful for opportunities that devour you. You must frame exploitation as growth, depletion as journey, burnout as learning experience. And when you can't maintain the performance of positivity, when the mask slips and your actual exhaustion shows, you've committed the unforgivable sin. You become negative, toxic, someone who brings the energy down. The system needs your positivity because your suffering, when acknowledged, becomes visible. And visible suffering asks questions. Why am I so tired? Why does this feel wrong? Why do I feel like I'm drowning when I'm supposedly free? These questions lead to structural analysis. And structural analysis leads to collective recognition. And collective recognition is the one thing neoliberalism cannot survive. So what do? How do you resist a system that's colonized even your thoughts? Han offers something that sounds too simple until you try it. Stop. Stop optimizing. Stop performing. Stop treating yourself as a project requiring constant improvement. The refusal to participate in your own exploitation is the beginning of resistance. This doesn't mean abandoning work or responsibility. It means recognizing that you're not a resource to be extracted. You're not a brand to be managed. You're not human capital requiring optimization. You're a person, and persons need rest, need opacity, need the freedom to be unproductive and unmeasured and invisible. When you take a walk without tracking your steps, you're resisting. When you have a conversation without considering its networking value, you're resisting. When you spend an afternoon doing absolutely nothing productive, you're resisting. The system calls this laziness because it can't acknowledge what it actually is: the reclamation of life from labor. What neoliberalism destroyed most thoroughly wasn't labor rights or social safety nets. It destroyed contemplation, the ability to think deeply without purpose, to experience without immediately processing that experience into content or data or self-improvement. Contemplation requires time that produces nothing. And time that produces nothing is the system's greatest terror. Because contemplation might lead to questions. Questions might lead to critique. And critique might lead to refusal. This is why every moment must be filled. Why silence must be interrupted. Why boredom must be immediately medicated with stimulation. Because in the gaps, in the empty moments, you might remember who you are beyond your productivity metrics. You might remember that you have a body that gets tired, a mind that needs rest, a life that shouldn't be entirely consumed by the project of optimizing yourself for market value. But here's what the system didn't anticipate. Exhaustion is universal. Everyone feels it. The performance is cracking everywhere you look. More people are burning out, dropping out, refusing the script they were given. And when you talk about this, when you name it, something extraordinary happens. Others recognize themselves in your words. The individual diagnosis transforms into collective recognition. You're not broken. We're not broken. The system is broken. And once you see that, once you really see it, you can't unsee it. This is what terrifies the architects of neoliberalism. Not individual rebellion, which can be pathologized and managed, but collective lucidity, mass refusal. The moment when enough people simultaneously recognize that the emperor has no clothes, that the freedom they were promised is actually a sophisticated form of servitude. Your exhaustion isn't personal failure. It's political consciousness waiting to be recognized. Your inability to keep up isn't inadequacy. It's your body's rebellion against the impossible. Your desire to stop, to rest, to refuse, these aren't symptoms of weakness. They're the first stirrings of resistance. The system taught you to love your chains by making them invisible, by making them feel like choices, by making them sound like freedom. But chains are chains, even when they're made of productivity apps and personal brands and the tyranny of positive thinking. And the first step toward breaking them is the simplest and most radical act imaginable. Stop pretending they're not there.